Hello and welcome to Unco. I'm your host, Timothy Buck. This week I sat down with Khoe. She was a designer for Apple for many years, and now she is the VP of Design at Khan Academy. We had a wonderful discussion this week about the intersection of design, technology, and culture. We talked about dark patterns, design with a capital D, and more. If you want to help me keep the show around, become a patron over at patreon.com/uncofm. Hi, Maylee.
Hi, Timothy.
How's it going?
Good. Glad we made this happen.
Yeah. I'm really excited to have you on the show. I think we have some interesting things to talk about. So I guess before we dive in too deep, can you introduce yourself and just give my audience a little bit of a background of who you are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. Sounds good. Hi, everyone. My name is Khoe. My last name is pronounced Khoe, which I realize is probably unintuitive to everybody except for people who speak Dutch. I'm currently serving as VP of Design at Khan Academy, which is a small educational nonprofit. We are a little bit of an economic experiment in that we're a nonprofit whose primary product is software for education. And the mission of the company is to provide a free world-class education for anyone, anywhere. So my team is designers, and we're also responsible for user research. And before that, I was at Apple for 7.5 years, which I think Timothy and I can talk about a little bit later. The other thing, I guess, to know about me is my background is a mix of engineering and design. Engineering, design, and prototyping, which I suppose is kind of a hybrid between engineering and design. So that's a little bit about my background. And I'm sure we can get into all of the sordid details depending on what you feel like asking, Timothy.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. I think when I first found you on Twitter, I followed you for a little while, and I kind of saw your description on Twitter, and I think that combination is really interesting. And the fact that you went to Khan Academy from Apple and the stuff that Khan Academy is doing is really cool, and I've been following it for a while now. So I was just interested in talking to you, maybe a little bit about like what you've been able to do at those companies, but also at some point I want to kind of dive into the intersection of all those different things that you've worked on, which is, design and research and technology, and then also art and culture. I think those are all intersecting in some really interesting ways now, and I think it could be a really interesting conversation.
Sounds great.
Cool. Well, I guess to start off, can you tell us a little bit more about what you did for Apple?
Oh yeah, sure. So I was there for 7.5 years. When I first joined, I didn't actually know what I was going to be working on, which is a common pattern, I think, when you get hired into Apple. And at that point in time, it turned out that I was working on taking what was then called .Mac and creating a suite of web apps, which I think at that time was a little less common, as well as working on the first web apps for the first iPhone. So that I had no idea I was going in to do. Obviously, they weren't telling us that in the fall of 2006 when I started. And so, in that first role I had at Apple, I had a chance to work on the first web apps for the first iPhone. And if you remember correctly, when we launched the iPhone, Steve said, "Oh, cool, you want to build apps? Build web apps."
Yeah.
And so we had been, me and Helen Ma is one of the people I collaborated with really closely. We were, building web apps on mobile Safari as mobile Safari was being built. And one of those things was the RSS reader that went out as part of the platform. And another thing was the Mobile Me Gallery, if anybody remembers that out there.
Yeah.
When you could share directly from iPhoto onto the web. So that happened. And I was on that team for a little while and, worked on other aspects of it. I think some of what became iCloud and what's now called a design system, although back then we weren't calling them design systems. And then I switched teams in 2010 and joined a group called HID Prototyping. And that team was actually in the hardware organization. And we played with sensors and sensor data to come up with new human interfaces for new human input. So brand new UI, what might it be for things like force touch and the Taptic engine? When real-time face tracking came out, a couple of us made a whole bunch of face effects, which are now everywhere.
Yeah.
But yeah, we were playing with those in 2010, and I'm still slightly resentful that nobody at the time understood when I made the beautifying face effects, which are also immensely popular now. But I think there just weren't the people in charge at that point in time didn't quite understand why people would want beautifying effects. But we did manage to ship hearts flying out of their heads, which was pretty great. So that happened. The Taptic engine and force touch, determining sizes for iPad mini, working on iPad Pro, just the early beginnings of the Pencil, and more recently the HomePod. Just a bunch of stuff. I think it's hard to kind of keep track of that stuff because I think we were so generative in that team.
Yeah. So were you working on kind of the early stages of all this stuff?
Super early stages. A lot of what we worked on didn't even have code names yet. They didn't even have the super secret code names. They were, it felt a little sometimes like working in a toy store, you never wanted to see the teddy bear with its guts out. We saw hardware with its guts out, looked sawed in half, looking very unpretty compared to the final ID. But it's fascinating, really deep in the guts. And I think that is where I really started to respect Apple on a whole other level that I feel like a lot of people out in the general audience don't get a chance to appreciate just how much work is put and care is put into the manufacturing of the devices and the design. It's a lot of stuff that's really easy to take for granted, but there's people that are literally inventing materials that are better for the environment. And I know that kind of stuff isn't glamorous the way that somebody wants to talk about, I don't know, there's other glamorous things. People want to talk about AR, they don't want to talk about rearranging molecules, but there's material scientists and they're doing really fascinating stuff. And hardware is no joke, manufacturing and all of that stuff. I think there's a lot of naivete about what it takes to ship hardware out there, and maybe all of us are less naive now that we've seen enough Kickstarters go by. But I have a lot of respect for people that work in hardware, particularly in Apple hardware. It's really, really hard. Hardware is hard.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I think that's a good point to call out all the people who've done Kickstarters for hardware, and they seem to never come out, or if they do, they're just nowhere near the quality that the video portrayed, and it's usually a couple years late. Yep.
Yeah. It's not, there's nobody just handing you a really nice toolkit of stuff that you can rearrange and bits on a screen. All of the parts need to come from somewhere, and they need to arrive, and they need to be put together, and people need to put them in boxes, and then they need to get shipped across the ocean. And you also have to be really mindful of, all of the things that can happen if you don't watch out for bad things that can happen along that journey. And all of that's it's an entirely different league.
Right, especially at the scale that Apple's working in.
Yes, the scale and the quality. And I think people forget that because the company's been around for a while, and people are starting to take it for granted. So I know I left, but the level of respect I have for people there just continues to be very high, especially the quality of the hardware and the material science people and people that work on the chips, and just so much stuff that doesn't really get the attention, and that people don't get the attention because it's so behind the scenes. But there's some just science, like just hard science happening back there. So it's pretty impressive.
Yeah, I think the people working on the silicon have been really impressing me. I think the team they have there is one of the best in the world, if not the best in the world. It's been amazing to see what they've done. When Steve Jobs first mentioned that they were even going to do that, I don't know, back with like the iPhone 4 or 5 or something like that. I remember the response from the tech community was like, "Why would you even do this? This is not something that you're going to be the best at." And then, a handful of years later, and the chips that they have in the iPhone of the 2-year-old iPhone are faster than the newest Snapdragon chip. It's crazy.
Yep. Oh no.
Yeah, let's just keep going, and I'll edit that out, and it'll be good.
Yeah, sounds good. I think that we were on a little tangent at the moment anyway, so we can kind of come back to the main thread.
Yeah, let's do that. So I think something that is an interesting conversation is how technology has become such a cultural force in a way in the last you could say 20, 30 years, but especially in the last, since the iPhone, it's become such a center of our culture, or the whole world's culture. And I think that should change the way that those of us who are building technology think about it, because it has a more important impact than just building an interesting device. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's especially interesting right at this moment in history, like as in halfway through the year in 2018, is that people are really starting to come around to realizing that. I mean, I think it's definitely been in the air for a couple of years, and a couple of sort of people even early on were bringing attention to it, but now more than ever, I think people are much more conscious of it. I'm not sure about the idea that it's created culture so much as it is like a force for spreading / amplifying existing parts of culture. I mean, I suppose there is, quote unquote internet culture and memes and aesthetics and stuff that are born that are amazing. But a lot of what I see going on, it feels like there are things that have existed or phenomena that have existed have become accelerated or become scaled or spread at a phenomenal rate. So yeah, there's so many aspects to it. I mean, one simple one, which I think we're seeing addressed now, is just like how much time are we putting into our technology and not into other things that we could be doing. I think, everybody that works in the various therapies of the world, particularly in the United States, but everywhere, is looking at everything from like neck pain and muscle soreness to, loneliness or other, fear of harassment on the internet, and people trying to break like technology addiction, and just so many aspects to it that people are trying to cope with. And then on the flip side, there's also really amazing positive things that have come out of it, like even if it's just somebody trying to find like an organ donor match and able to do so and wouldn't have been able to do so otherwise, like in, crowdsourcing and all kinds of other phenomenon that have been really positive. So I think we're really seeing amplification at both sides. I don't think it's an option not to think about it. It's just not. No. It's not okay anymore to, at least in my books, it's not okay anymore not to consider it when you're building. And I think it requires an awareness of what's going on off the screen and what's going on with the human and between the humans outside the screen. I don't think everybody's there yet. I think a lot of people are still really, really enamored with whatever's inside the glowing rectangle and how to make numbers go up depending on what parts of that interface people tap on, but more and more people are starting to realize that we have to be designing for a whole system and society and humanity, not just, a little rectangle of software.
Right. No, that's a good point. I had Georgia Dow on the show a while back, and she's a psychotherapist and she's a tech writer for iMore, and so she had some really interesting perspective about how it ties into mental health, which you kind of touched on there when you're talking about therapy. I think that's an important thing that we're beginning to see more and more people think and talk about. I feel like in the last couple of years, the conversations around bullying online and around you were just like Google and Apple just released updates to their software that allow you to track how much you're using different apps and to prevent yourself from using an app after you've used it for a certain amount of hours in a day. And I think, like you were saying, that's showing that these companies are starting to think that way and starting to give us the tools to kind of fight back against how data-driven app creators have been. Because they can see how effective their changes are, and they can A, B, C, and test something to see which is the most effective at keeping you in their tool or app or game or whatever it may be. They're designed to be addictive, and the more addictive they are, then the more money that company may make. And so their entire incentive is the opposite of a healthy human. We want as many people almost just using these tools as much as possible, and so we need to give the consumer a way to fight back against that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of I think it kind of just stems from what we measure as a baseline for everything, right? People, it's human nature to try and maximize whatever numbers or indicators that we're seeing as a measure of our progress. So, yeah, I think it's been pretty natural for people to kind of chase a kind of engagement that isn't necessarily healthy for us as organisms.
Yeah, I definitely see it in my own life, and I even though I see it, I still find myself continuing to to respond to it, even though I know what's happening.
It's amazing. My therapist actually suggested I uninstall Twitter. It was pretty amazing. She said, "How about you just delete it from your phone?" I was like, "Oh, okay."
Yeah, Twitter is my bane as well. I got pretty good. I deleted Facebook from my phone, and that wasn't really that big of a deal. And then I installed this Chrome browser extension, or I have one for Safari as well, that blocks the Facebook timeline. Mm-hmm. So if I log in, all I do is look at my notifications, see if anybody messaged me, and then I don't fall into the timeline hole.
Oh yeah, I actually left Facebook years ago, and it's been great. I think the other thing with Facebook, it's interesting. Yeah. I was visiting a friend in Turkey a couple years ago, and she mentioned that in Turkish language, there's multiple words for friend, and all of them mean different things. There's different relationships. And it really made me just start thinking about that term friend, friending somebody on Facebook, and how it's sort of reduced the relationship to something that wasn't necessarily the case. And I just remember looking at a feed and seeing lots of things that I didn't care about, didn't want to see. And a lot of it was just not a reflection of what was going on in people's lives. Especially, I noticed this especially on Sunday nights. I think people come back from their weekends, and everybody tries to post all of the amazing things from the weekend. It's almost like this weird obligation of a social dance that everybody participates in, and it's not True. I think I've always been a big believer in transparency as far as like going through difficult shit in life, because I think if you have a society where nobody actually talks about real difficult things, not in a way that's needy, like not in a way where you need people to say like, oh, I feel, like just factually, like shit happens to everybody. And if we don't talk about it in a way that's like genuine, even just among friends, everybody thinks that they're, it's them. And I feel like what I was seeing on Facebook was this massive amplification of that. So for example, I'll give you like a silly example, like when people get married, or when they get engaged, actually, when people get engaged and they're planning for a wedding, I tell them, look, like I've been a wedding photographer. I'm old enough that I've seen lots of people get married. If you have no serious drama go down at your wedding, you're lucky. Most people have really, really dramatic things. Like usually there's some family member acting up or something that's very difficult that happens during a wedding, but you never see any of it on Facebook. So everybody assumes that like that stuff doesn't happen, when in actual fact, it almost always happens. Because it's a really emotional time for people. And then I feel like we're all living with this like bubble reality that doesn't actually exist. So yeah, I don't know. I left Facebook years ago, and and sometimes I feel like a non-emotional asshole or something for like not keeping up with everybody. But I think there's also a thing that happens. You get older and you have more and more contacts, and you just can't humanly keep up with everything. So I don't miss it. I mean, I think the other thing that is the scary part on Twitter and on other things, like other aspects of online culture, is the doxing, and the just scary internet abuse stuff. That's another thing that we absolutely have to address. I don't think that can, keep going. It's like,
no, I agree.
It's just too hard.
Yeah, I think on the lines you're talking about for Facebook, I find I don't really use it very much anymore, but I see a similar thing on Instagram where everybody is posting it's like a highlight reel of their life, and it seems like people aren't comfortable sharing that they actually have hard things going on, or that everything isn't perfect. And I rarely see on Instagram anybody being real about their life and about what's going on. And I feel like on Twitter, you still have some issues with that, but I find at least the people that I follow on Twitter tend to be a lot more honest about how they're feeling and about what's going on. And maybe it's just because you post more on Twitter than you do on those other things, but I find it more honest.
Yeah. I also like the fact that we're not conflating like relationships of information with friendship, because those might or might not be the same thing. So that's another thing I enjoy about Twitter.
I found that issue. Yeah, I found that issue on Facebook, where you like feel like you can't unfollow or unfriend people, right? Because then you're like saying they're not your friend, but then they're posting a bunch of stuff you don't want to see, and you have to see it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah. So that's all happened. I guess, like, if we're talking kind of to loop back around to you asking about my background, I think about, and I started at Apple, it would have been like, it's almost 12 years ago now, and the world has changed a lot since then. So.
Yeah, I think it's a kind of along those same lines about how like the intersection of design and art and technology and culture. It seems like Apple's done a lot to bring design to the forefront of technology. And I think when I was like in middle school, tech wasn't really, at least I didn't see it as associated with design so much. And then now I think it's a pretty, maybe it's just the part of the world that I'm in, but it's really common for people creating technology and creating software and even hardware are very they're very understanding of the fact that design is valuable, and that it adds it adds a lot of value and is worth paying for and is worth investing in, because even if you can't clearly define how it's adding value, it is, and it's improving the experience. And I think that is one aspect in which like technology's intersection with that other thing has been kind of amplified over the last, I don't know, decade.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where people didn't really understand what could be, and Apple came and shoved the bar higher, so people came to expect it a lot more. One thing I'll call out, though, is that I think that a lot of people are still conflating, or they're still conflating the fact that Apple's design, was notoriously great with it being purely aesthetic. And I'm frankly kind of tired of that. Like, I think there's still too many people out there that I find that they think that you can just make a thing pretty at the end, and that designers make things beautiful, and that is what our job is. But right. The fact is, like, you basically have your hands tied if you can't influence the functionality, or the flow, or frankly the strategy. It's like if you think that you care about the importance of design, and you think that you're hiring designers to make things pretty, then like you need to look a little deeper, because you can give designers a problem that they can't. There's nothing they can do to fix it, because you've asked for something that doesn't make actual sense. And you can put all the pretty.
To the definition.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say you can put all the pretty on it you want, but it's still just not going to be like part of what the good design was, in the heyday, was usability. Was making something simple and easy to use and intuitive for people to walk up to and use, as opposed to just like looking slick.
Yeah.
And I think people forget that.
And I think that comes back to the definition of design. I think you're right. Still, even today, a lot of people think of design as a beautification of a thing, but in reality, like, design is from beginning to end, making sure that it's got to be designed from the very beginning. Like, it has to be thought, the structure of how there's like software design, there's designing the flow, there's designing the usability, there's designing the UI, there's
and there's like, and then what you're designing, right? Like, design with a capital D includes understanding the people that you're serving, or what it is that you will be able to, what they're trying to accomplish, and all of that as well.
Right, like deciding what problem you're trying to solve, and making sure that you're building something that actually solves that problem, instead of just building a tool that does an action.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So that part, I think that people forget about. Still, like, sadly too frequently, but I don't know. It's funny. I think this came up in conversation with I was chatting with a couple of friends, like including Andy, who I've worked with pretty closely for a couple of years now, and we were talking about reasons for hiring designers. And you're like, what is it that you look for in a designer? And I think it was like us and some friends over at Khoe all agree that the number one thing we look for is reasons. You need to have reasons why you make certain decisions when you're designing something. That's so important.
That's a really...
Sorry.
I just said that's a really good simplification.
Yeah. And I think it goes deep, right? Because like, I think that, if we're going to talk about design with a capital D, we need to include this, the cultural stuff that you were bringing up earlier. I think, for example, I was talking to Linda Dong, who's a designer I used to work with at Apple, and I think she has this term, dark patterns, which I like, which is also thinking about like what is the abuse pattern, or what is the like not good for the user pattern that is possible. Like both of those things are things that you need to be able to consider, and it's part of the design work. Like,
I saw a really terrible example of that just recently. It was for what's the law in the Europe about like data privacy and stuff? I forget what it's called, but Facebook was updating their terms of service for it, and on the page they had hard coded in to make it look like you had both messages and friend requests at the top for everybody, so that you were more likely to accept their new terms and move forward, which is just one of those things that it's like a dark design pattern. Just don't lie to people. And the fact that they were like purposely lying to people because they knew that it would increase the number of people who accepted the new terms is the definition of a dark design pattern.
Yeah. Yep. That stuff is everywhere now. But I think it's all, it's all just because of the underlying incentive structures that we have that are, what is it that we call success? And right. Whatever it is that we call success is what people will build for.
Yeah, and a lot of times it's the person who made that decision or the manager who said that needed to happen is being they're being measured by that in some way. Like their success is, okay, you need to make sure that the highest percentage of people possible do not stop Facebook because of GDPR, I think is what's called, GP, whatever, I don't know. Yeah, that because of the new changes, it makes sure that as many people continue to use Facebook after these changes as possible. And that, I'm sure, was effective at that. I'm sure it helped. But it was also not it was also not the right thing to do in that situation. And I think that that's tough to put that on people as well when they're like, we're asking somebody in that position to kind of like push back against all of the incentives that they have, right? And maybe like not get that bonus or not whatever because it isn't, at least from the outside, it just appears like the wrong thing to do. But the problem is the incentive structure, right? Like we've set it up in a way that these companies are incentivized to do the wrong things. And I don't know how to fix that.
Yeah, I think I learned this the hard way in one of my earlier jobs. I was actually working at Microsoft, and some very excited biz dev guy that I was working with struck a deal with a porn company that, like, if people searched on some Microsoft search thing, that if they searched for a term that might indicate that they were searching for porn, then we could pass them off to this other party and we would get some kickback. Like, this was Microsoft. We were going to get some sort of kickback for like passing people off to this third party porn site. And they wanted me to like design the flow for the handoff. This was like a long time ago. And I remember just thinking, yeah, like, crap, if that's what this guy is being measured on, then like, that's what he's going to do. Like, he's like, cool, we're going to generate some revenue from all the people using the search engine to look at porn. I'm like, how did I wind up designing this flow? Yeah, right. It was pretty, yeah, that was like not, I've forgotten about that actually until you were talking just now. I was like, oh, right, that's when I learned this lesson. It was like almost 20 years ago now. And like, I was like, oh, right, yep, if you just, that's what people are being measured on, that's what they're going to do.
Yeah, and I think this is a lesson that...
But we're not robots. Like, we don't have to. We could also just say no and vote with our feet and, like, refuse. Which we're seeing more and more people do, which I think is also really cool culturally, that people are trying to push back from inside their companies. I think that's really cool.
Right, and I think the more that we talk about it outside of these companies and we make it clear that we do care, and that we are noticing that these types of things are happening, then the more empowered people in the company are going to be, because it even gives them some sort of like ammunition in their response, right? Like the next time somebody at Facebook is asked to do something like this, they can hopefully push back and say, hey, we did this here with GDPR, and here are a bunch of articles and all this negative stuff that happened because of that. And maybe they'll have a little bit of ammunition to kind of like argue back and say, no, this is like not the type of company that we need to be. But it really needs to start at the top, right? It needs to start from the executives of these companies saying, like, it's not all about the top line or the bottom line. It's about making sure that we as a company are like making money in a way that is that we can be proud of. And and this comes from like the massive companies like Apple, Microsoft, Google, Facebook, that whole group, all the way down to little small software companies, any size company. Like I think it's important that our leaders and those of us who aren't executives either to be pushing for like ethical business. And there's not like an easy one size fits all answer for that, but I think it's really important that we are even thinking about those things.
I think one of the things that we really need to do is get creative about what we measure. Because I think a lot of the times people will kind of measure the most obvious thing because it's easy. And there's a lot of like, cool, like this is easy, we'll just use this as a proxy. But it's much harder to connect like follow-on effects back to certain actions. And I think a lot of the times when like negative follow-on effects happen, it is a lot of people's natural tendency to go into the dark pattern place. Like, oh, people want to unsubscribe. Let's make it hard for them to unsubscribe. You know, that type of thing.
Yeah.
And I think, I think that if we're able to kind of show more complex follow-on like systems numbers, that might be one way of like speaking to people whose minds work primarily like that. I mean, a lot of the times the qualitative measures are the ones that will show those problems first. It's the stuff that's coming up in conversations with your users usually starts out more qualitative. I think those things are oftentimes the leading indicators of things that are going to go wrong further on down the line. And a lot of the times it's harder to put numbers to those things. But I think if we were a little bit more fluent at providing numerical measures or estimates for some stuff that is currently not that measured, that might be a way of kind of translating between languages, right? Because there's some people that don't feel that, like they need to have numbers put to it. And so like if we can figure out how to do that and how to measure things that are not the usual suspects for measurement, get a little more creative with that, and then have those be like top line numbers that everybody that's an executive is forced to look at, for example. Be a way of doing it and say like, hey, we've noticed that, you know, when we trace this effect to this effect, then you actually can see an indicator and you can see the way that, you know, our public reputation started declining right around here because of these decisions we made over here. And while we thought it made the numbers go up over here, you could actually see that a year and a half later it was causing like huge declines. You know, if we were actually able to construct an argument that way, I think we could.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think at least it's a good ambition to have, and I frankly think that we need to do it not just for technology or inside a tech company, but like as a society.
Yeah.
Like I have some ideas for alternative things we could measure that might make us behave a little bit better as a human race, because clearly whatever we've been measuring has led to a lot of fallout effects that we're not quite happy with right now. So
right.
Yeah.
I agree. So I guess we're kind of rounding out the show here. What is one thing that you find unusual in tech right now?
I mean, I think it actually kind of works nicely with what we've been talking about the rest of the show, or like where we've landed, which is that people are starting to think whole system. Like people are really starting to think more about what are alternative like economic structures? What are ways that we can actually work deeply towards good? What are ways that we can consider the whole human rather than having everybody sort of locked away behind a tiny rectangle? I think, how can we design the community that we want and have the technology be part of it rather than the other way around? Like all of those kinds of questions, I think are the ones that are more interesting right now. And people are, at least I think people that are going into it with their eyes open now are starting to be a little bit less like, oh, ooh, shiny, look, there's this new piece of technology, and asking some of the more difficult questions, which is like, what is this for? Is this actually getting us closer to what we're trying to achieve right now? Because we do have some like urgent things that we need to be working towards as a human race. And are we doing that thing, or am I just enamored with the tech? So I feel like more and more people's eyes are starting to open, and we're starting to ask ourselves those questions. And I think it's high time. So that I think is interesting. There's different theories of change around that work. So some people like, I think the people at Dynamic Land, and like our community over there is doing some interesting stuff with having, turned a computer inside out and having it feel like cooking with friends. I think that organizations like Khan Academy and Code for America and, a bunch of other people that are also experimental as far as like trying to work towards, education or helping people in education be able to make better use of their time or get help when they need it. All the people that are doing interesting stuff to kind of experiment with alternative economic things. And I'm not necessarily talking about like Bitcoin or anything like that, but because that's a whole other conversation. But just, what are other things that we can do in terms of like incentive systems or sharing or anything like that? Like actual sharing versus quote unquote sharing
Right.
of goods, like all of the stuff where people are taking the time to do some deeper critical thinking, and then not necessarily expecting that technology is necessarily going to be a solution, because it isn't the solution to everything, but trying to see how it can fit in or be part of the solution. So I think that we probably spent a little bit of a long time saying like, oh, this is going to solve everything, especially people that work in technology and are like enamored with it, are like, it can solve all of the things. Here, take the technology and it will make everything better. And like, I think that wool is coming off people's eyes, and that's what I consider to be unusual about this moment in history. And I hope that, more and more people start to be able to be whole system thinkers, and it makes for a more difficult problem to solve, frankly, but I think that we have to do it. So I'm excited for that. Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether or not that actually answers your question, because I'm not pointing to like one technological innovation and saying like, this thing is neat. But I think that like, if I were to talk about
No, yeah, that's
AR
perfect.
or VR or machine learning or it's like all of those things don't matter unless we're doing something with it that's like more deeply meaningful. Right.
I completely agree. I think I purposefully make the question a little bit vague so that we can each guest has their own take on it, right? So
Yeah.
I asked that each time, and it tied right into our conversation today. And another guest who may be really interested in AR will go down that path and talk about that. But I think that was a really helpful answer, and it's a good point of something that is unusual about this point in history in general, but also in the history of technology. I think that's helpful.
Yeah.
So where can people find you on the internet, maybe?
Probably the easiest place to find me is on Twitter. Speaking of which, I will admit that I did uninstall it from my phone, but I still occasionally like hop on and tweet something. So my Twitter handle is Mayli, MAYLI. So like May, like the month, and then LI. That's probably the best place. I think, I'm not great right now at documenting my work or talking much about it, but it is a resolution I have to write more. Writing on the internet is terrifying, but I really, I am open to being peer pressured to write about things. If anybody wants to peer pressure me to write about things, because I think that I could definitely use the encouragement. I'm openly scared of it, but I do want to do it.
Yeah. Well, I would definitely read it. I think it would definitely be interesting.
Awesome. Yeah. So is there anything that you feel like, anything else you think your listeners would want to know before we sign off here?
You guys can find me on Twitter at TimothyBuckSF, and you can find Unco on Twitter at _UncoFM. And yeah, that's it. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Maylee.
Thanks so much for having me, Timothy.